Hello and welcome to Tiski Sour. Sorry for the short delay. We've only got one topic today and one guest in the studio. I'm also going to be beaming in a guest from New York. We are talking about the controversy, the row that has rolled on and on for over 2 years now. It's about the issue of anti-Semitism or alleged anti-Semitism. Well, we'll go on to this. I don't need to add qualifiers. In the Labour Party since Jeremy Corbyn has become leader, and how well he has dealt with it, if he's been too slow to clamp down on instances of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Obviously, this debate has exploded again because of the NEC's decision not to implement the IHRA definition and examples of anti-Semitism in full, and was fed by comments made by Pete Wilsman, a member of the NEC. We'll talk about those specific issues later on in the show, but we're going to mainly take a sort of broader look at those issues, which don't seem to be going away. To discuss this, I could not be joined by a more fortuitous guest than Barnaby Raine, who is a PhD student at Columbia in Life After Capitalism in the work of Marx, Keynes and Lenin.
If I end up doing what I plan on doing, then it will be something about that, yes.
Excellent. Barnaby has also recently written a much shared article for Novara Media titled How Labour's Dreadful Anti-Semitism Debate Has to Change. And you've been on many a news channel recently, right?
I have. I've been having to borrow shirts from other people to look smarter than I am able to look today among comrades.
I had to do that yesterday as well, actually. I've been borrowing...
I only own 2 shirts.
I've been borrowing James's boyfriend's collarless shirt.
Is this the first he's found out about it?
No, they both know. This is this is not a gossipy secret. Later on in the show, I talked to Norman Finkelstein in New York last night. He's a renowned scholar on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the politics of the Holocaust. That will be probably in about 40 minutes. Obviously, it would have been nice to have a live debate with Norman, but we don't have the technical capacity to do live debates when someone's remote. So it's going to be...
Give them money.
A short... Yeah, please.
Support Novara.
So it's going to be a short interview, which is sort of an intervention from Norman, which we're going to reply to in the studio. So to kick us off, Barnaby, we're going to start from the article you wrote. What is so dreadful about Labour's anti-Semitism debate, and in what way does it need to change?
Well, it's defined by a false choice. So it's overwhelmingly dominated by people who believe in practice, though most people denounce this conflation in theory, that we can either be tough on the criminal abuses of the Israeli state and much more soft in tackling anti-Semitism, or really tough in fighting anti-Semitism and go very soft on not just the criminal abuse of the Israeli state, but also, and this is really important and not often enough raised, our obligations of solidarity with the Palestinian people who are struggling against state racism and have been since 1948 at least. So I think that's a false choice. I think the consistently anti-racist position is to be have a very tough line on both of those things. So that means neither running around the country condemning smears and witch hunts against alleged anti-Semites when we should be focusing on getting rid of anti-Semitism from the left, nor does it mean adopting a definition of anti-Semitism which says in its examples that to claim that the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. I mean, we should be really, really clear about quite how extraordinary it is that we're having an allegedly anti-racist debate in which the Palestinian people who were chased from their homes, dispossessed, and who now live as refugees or stateless or under military occupation have been rendered invisible in a country which is very, very bad at talking about colonialism in general, and an example of atrocious settler colonial history, a real history with real facts and lots of brilliant archival work that was done by the new historians, for example, Israeli historians. That's just been rendered invisible. So the consistently anti-racist position is to say that we should champion Palestinians and their struggle, and we should see nothing about that championing that should force us to go soft on anti-Semitism.
We'll look into the merits and the disadvantages of the IHRA examples a bit later on. First, I really want to focus on the nature of the conflict that's going on in the Labour Party. Obviously, this is a huge row. I mean, there's clearly, well, there's more than 2 sides, but there's people who are in quite heavy conflict. You've been taking the line like many commentators have, especially in this round, that the left should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So the idea is, sort of as you just explained, that the left can clamp down on anti-Semitism. It can recognise that anti-Semitism is a problem in the Labour Party, whilst at the same time recognising that at times it has been exaggerated, at times it has been fabricated, and most of the time it's being weaponised to damage Jeremy Corbyn, his leadership, to try and delegitimise his supporters, both by political enemies who don't like him for him being a socialist, and then others because he's pro-Palestine, so they think he could be a threat to the interest of the state of Israel. And that seems like a fairly uncontroversial opinion, but there are definitely people who'll be watching this. I have arguments with people on Twitter all the time who think that only one of those is true. So on the one side, there's people who basically claim that if you say anti-Semitism is being weaponized or fabricated, that itself is an anti-Semitic trope. So that to even suggest that this could be being used as a political weapon is itself racist, as it were.
Yeah.
On the other side of the people saying to give an inch, to say that there is any anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, or to say that it's in any way significant, is to lose perspective, to miss the point. So what I want you to do, it's a difficult task, is to try and persuade both of those groups who are likely in our audience.
Great. So let's start with the people who say, how dare you say it's a smear? Now, they're right about one thing, which is to weaponize anti-Semitism has worrying tinges of anti-Semitism itself to it, because to weaponize anti-Semitism is to treat Jews as a convenient political tool with which to make your broader points. So, if right-wing MPs in the Labour Party are using anti-Semitism to try to attack Jeremy Corbyn, people are right that there's something a bit dodgy and possibly even a bit anti-Semitic about them doing so. I think, though, it's completely wrong to say that this hasn't been a weaponized smear. And as I'll go on to say, saying that shouldn't rule out also thinking that it's a real problem. So firstly, the evidence that we have is pretty clear on this. We have good polling from YouGov. We have survey evidence from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is a pretty good think tank, that anti-Semitism is a consistent live problem across British political life, that a large minority of the population subscribes to at least one anti-Semitic view, and that's roughly consistent between the political parties, with more anti-Semites in UKIP than in the other parties, but the Tories and Labour are about the same. So the first question is, so if anti-Semitism is a real problem across political parties, why all the focus on the Labour Party? Secondly, we have clear cases of anti-Semitism being misdiagnosed by people who don't really know what they're talking about but are trying to fight a political agenda. One thing that particularly struck me, I remember Guido Fawkes, the right-wing blogger, who I don't believe is an expert on defining anti-Semitism, announced that Avi Schleim, one of the leading Israeli historians of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, was an anti-Semite. He just sort of threw that allegation casually around. I think that demonstrates some of the problems here. And then thirdly, we live in a country, Britain's racist, right? We live in a country full of bigotries. And when Tom Harris, right-wing former Labour MP, finally leaves the Labour Party the other night, amid an anti-Semitism scandal.
For the second time as well, I think.
So is that for the second time?
I think he also tweeted in 2015 that he'd just left the Labour Party.
Right. Well, for him to make it look now as a kind of anti-racist move because he's so opposed to anti-Semitism, is bound to make our ears prick up when this is someone who declares himself a proud Romaphobe in an article a few years ago and says that Roma people are filthy. Clearly he's a racist. When Tom Watson says he's really concerned with anti-Semitism and then he runs by-election campaigns where he throws around dog whistles by saying Labour stands up for you, Lib Dems only stand up for failed asylum seekers. Clearly he's relaxed about racism in some cases. Now, I don't think it's impossible for people to be concerned about anti-Semitism and have a blind spot in other cases. But it really challenges the idea that there's a distinctive problem that Corbyn has brought to British politics, and that anti-Semitism and indeed bigotry itself is something that's a problem on the far left and that's new in the age of Corbyn. It's also worth noting that sometimes people on the right of the Labour Party and outside have spoken a bit clumsily and have talked about, as Ian Mackenzie, the former chair of the Lewisham East Labour Party, talked about his glee that anti-Semitism was cutting through in opposing Corbyn in a way he said that the Hamas IRA stuff never had done. So when they're admitting that they're weaponising it, I think it's strange for people on the left to deny that. I also think there's a lot of selective focus around what kind of anti-Semitism outrages us. So I was a little irritated to get an email from the Board of Deputies of British Jews, nominally sort of represents me, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel in a big party organised by or led by Prince Charles. Prince Charles is someone who once complained that the Jewish lobby runs America. If you were a member of the Labour Party and you said that, I think the Board of Deputies would rightly be outraged. But when aristocrats are anti-Semites, and I have no doubt that the royal family are probably pretty anti-Semitic, because aristocrats always have been, we turn a blind eye to that. When the chairman of the Tory party was at the Home Affairs Select Committee, and was asked about a litany of cases of anti-Semitism in the Tory party, like people saying that they could never vote for Ed Miliband because he was a Jew, people saying they wish they were Jews but they don't have enough money and big enough noses. He just didn't know about it. They just didn't care, and they were given a free pass on it. So all these things, I think, combine with the attempt to force the Labour Party to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism which would silence genuine historical discussion of the settler colonial character of the Israeli state. All of these things together suggest to people that that this is a smear. I have more things to say about how that's not just cynical, but I suspect you want me to move on to talk about
let's do the
other
if
side.
We've just
why it
done
really
walking,
exists.
let's do chewing gum.
Let's do chewing gum. Right, so people who like what I was saying there will dislike what I'm saying here and vice versa, but been a 43% spike, I think it is, in 45% spike in cases of anti-Semitic hate crime since 2014. We've got cases of Labour councillors and council candidates tweeting out that Hitler was right, that the Rothschilds control the world's banks. These are not made-up cases. They're not people on Twitter, as has sometimes been alleged, who are really agents of the Israeli state making fake accounts. These are verified cases of Labour councillors and candidates.
Although saying that it's been proven that lots of anti-Semitism on Twitter that's purported to be from Labour Party members is actually just troll accounts. There was a complaint that went from the Jewish Labour movement to the Labour Party with, I think, 250 accounts that they that had posted anti-Semitic tweets, and it turned out that the vast majority weren't Labour Party members. But you're right, there are definitely some cases.
Yeah. But look, I'm sure the same is true of misogyny, right? If it were the case that there was an endemic problem with loads of people on social media, and if the internet didn't exist, this wouldn't be a scandal, not because anti-Semitism wouldn't exist, but just because people it wouldn't be recorded in writing for all eternity. If there were a problem on social media with people spouting misogynistic abuse, I'm sure some troll accounts would set up to fake misogynistic abuse. That wouldn't mean the right response on the left would be to say misogyny is not a problem. We should recognise that. This is, again, walking and chewing gum. So when you have people complaining, as in Barnet, that there's an overrepresentation of Jews in the capitalist ruling class, when the response from members of Barnet Momentum is then to debate whether this is really anti-Semitic, that to me demonstrates a serious failing of political education, right? It's a view that we should have our debates by proxy, so that, if this is supporters of the State of Israel or opponents of Jeremy Corbyn trying to weaponize it, then we should deny it's a problem, rather than dealing with the problem and having the debates where they don't want to have them, which is about renationalizing the railways or imposing sanctions on the State of Israel, which, isn't Labour Party policy, and I wish it were. So it's a kind of tactical, I think, misjudgment. It has the debate where the right wants to have it. And it's a failure of left-wing principle. We shouldn't ever seek to be apologists for prejudice. We should have a different analysis on the left, right? We should think that bigotry isn't a case of a few bad apples. It is endemic to hierarchical societies, because the easiest response to experiences of suffering and injustice and oppression is to imagine a conspiratorial hand behind the scenes controlling all that's wrong in your life. Marx is such an important social critic, partly for pointing out that social structures produce logics that imprison everybody, and the war on the left is with those grand social structures like capital, and not with individual capitalists who just decide to be evil because they wake up one morning and want to be evil. And neither is it with individual Jews who wake up one morning and decide they want to be evil. That's obviously even worse. That's an anti-Semitic view. So I think we should think on the left that we have a confident anti-racist tradition, and we should tap into it much more and not think that anti-Semites are on the fringes of our politics, so we have to sort of make apologies for them.
I think we should move straight on to how you define or how you think of anti-Semitism. So you'd said it would be illegitimate for Barnet Momentum, was it, to sort of have a debate about, is it anti-Semitic to say that there's a disproportionate number of Jews in the capitalist class? Was that it?
Yeah, the ruling class.
So can you explain to me what you see as contemporary anti-Semitism? How does it manifest? How does one tell the difference between something that is or is not anti-Semitic? How should we recognise it when we see it?
Well, this is always difficult in different individual cases, but the broad principle, I think, is that anti-Semitism relies upon conjuring an imaginary image of an ethnically coherent body, a Jew, who is substantively different from the rest of society, just as Islamophobia relies on conjuring this image of this terrifying image of the Muslim. And lots of politics that doesn't actually demand the reopening of the gas chambers can rely upon that image, can have an imaginary in which there are these people called Jews who act as a coherent body and have different interests from the rest of us. Zionism reproduces anti-Semitic thinking in its foundational claim that Jews have different interests from non-Jews. So this is true across the political spectrum. But lots of people, I think, believe this. As I say, the evidence is that lots of people are willing to sign up to anti-Semitic statements.
Let's delve into that a little bit, actually,
Yeah.
because and I think lots of people, when they hear that, many people in society think that there is a Jewish conspiracy, basically. It's kind of what you're describing, that controls society. It seems rather fringe. I mean, I don't think I've ever met anyone that actually believes that. I've seen it on Twitter, but I don't know what evidence do we have that that is a widely held view?
Well, as I say, one has to differentiate between people who have on their bookshelves copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and really believe that they're being watched over constantly by Jews who were trying to control their lives, and people who would refute and would repudiate those kinds of claims immediately, but actually harbour bigotries where they turn on the TV and see Western support for the state of Israel and think, oh well, we know why that is, don't we? It's because the Jews deliver it, rather than having interest in the kind of analysis that Marx wants us to be interested in, which is a structural analysis of the way in which power operates, so that Western societies have an interest in imperialist operations in the Middle East, not because Jews sort of force them to. So there's this conservative element of anti-Semitic thinking. It wants to salvage the image of Western society by saying, really, the problem isn't organic to hierarchical societies. It's just some foreign conspiratorial element that planted the problem there. Now, people don't have to articulate that aggressively and explicitly like neo-Nazis to have a sense that politics is really about different cultural groups which have distinctive interests and which stand up for their interests and which ruin things for the rest of us. I think there are important things about contemporary anti-Semitism. We need to update some of our thinking in the light of an age of neoliberalism. So I think that much anti-Semitism that you see on the internet now outside the far right doesn't rely on thinking that we should reopen the gas chambers, doesn't rely on thinking that this conspiratorial group is easily zapped and we can save our society by getting rid of them, as Hitler thought. It's a much more pessimistic thinking, which actually demobilizes radical politics by saying, no, you can't change anything because they will never let you, and they are the lizards, or in, I think, slightly more widespread than we realize, tropes, they are something like the Jews. So I think these kinds of views are more embedded in societies than we accept on the left. And we should be interested in saying prejudice is endemic in our societies. Misogyny is absolutely endemic in our society. We know that, and feminist politics has taught us that at least since the 1960s. Homophobia is endemic, and the gay liberation movement taught us that in thinking about the very structure of our social relations, of our patriarchal social relations, and how they embed homophobia. We now think similar things about transphobia, for example. I think we should be able to say the same about anti-Semitism without giving in to the view that it's a special problem that Jeremy Corbyn has somehow invented or that his Labour Party has created.
I mean, lots of this row, lots of the controversy has played out between different representatives of British Jewry, or people who are claiming to represent British Jewry, and the Labour Party, and then sort of competing claims about who is the true representative of British Jews. I think for people like myself who didn't have much knowledge of Jewish communal politics before this all happened, it was quite confusing. Who are the Board of Deputies? Who are the Jewish Leadership Council? So I would like us to talk a bit about who these different groups are. So the Jewish Labour Movement have been they're the official affiliated organisation attached to the Labour Party. They like to say that they are the mainstream official voice for Labour Jews, and that there's Jewish Voice for Labour, which is sort of trying to challenge the monopolisation of that sort of representative claim by the Jewish Labour Movement. At the same time, you've got the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council. It's those two organisations that organised the Enough is Enough demo. Was that 2 months ago or something?
I can't remember exactly when.
And that was when Labour refused to implement the IHRA definition and examples, I think.
It was. I don't think the row was about exactly that now.
What was that about?
I think it was in the aftermath of the emergence of Corbyn having supported an
the
anti-Semitic
wall.
mural.
Yeah, that was the mural. God, there's so many different iterations of this row, isn't there?
It was an anti-racist demonstration that featured members of parliament from the DUP, which is a party
Yeah.
established to block civil rights in Ireland, in the north of Ireland. So, again, we should be sceptical of some of this while thinking that loads of people, and I know some of them, Jews who went on that demonstration, were seriously and honestly concerned about anti-Semitism, and we shouldn't dismiss that. But yeah, go on.
So I suppose the question is, how seriously should we take the claims of the Jewish labour movement? How seriously should we take the claims of the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council? I mean, I think many people, many Corbyn supporters would have looked at that Enough is Enough demo and thought that that was quite hyperbolic and thought that it seemed fairly politically motivated. The fact that it was because someone had liked a picture of a mural once, and then this was a huge media furore outside of
But
Parliament.
it wasn't just because of that. It was because people felt that was the apex after a long list of scandals. But yeah.
So let's talk about how the relationship between the Labour Party leadership and these big communal organisations broke down. What's your analysis of that breakdown? To what extent was that driven by an anti-Corbyn, pro-Israel politics? And to what extent was that by genuine, widespread concerns of the British Jewish community about the Labour Party expressed via their official communal organs?
Well, again, it helps to look at evidence. We have good survey data that shows what British Jews think about anti-Semitism in Britain. And it suggests that there's a big incongruity between the realities of anti-Semitism in Britain and how most British Jews feel. The reality, as I've said, is that it's a widespread problem across British society. Most British Jews feel that it's much, much more of a problem in the Labour Party. So clearly, the JVL perspective is not, the perspective of most.
So JVL is Jewish Voices for Labour,
who are more pro-Corbyn.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think that and while the Board of Deputies is very imperfectly democratic, it has deputies from synagogues who are not there on an especially democratic basis. The Jewish Leadership Council, the JLC, is not democratic at all. The evidence is that they represent a very significant chunk of Jews in Britain. I think we should be wary, and I have used this language in the past and now think I should be wary of it, of the language of the Jewish community, which is a kind of like, people who remember New Labour's attempts at relating to ethnic minority communities will remember this attempt to conjure communities as homogenous units. I don't know whether the Jewish community means, I think people who use the term mean very different things by it, and I don't know whether the Jewish community means people who are members of a synagogue, for example, people who are members of an Orthodox synagogue, even more so, who live in quite concentrated parts of London and Leeds and Manchester, or whether it's anyone who thinks of themselves as Jewish but might have nothing to do with that world at all, or whether it's people who don't normally think of themselves as Jewish but suddenly do when anti-Semitism becomes a subject for debate. So I think, when we talk about British Jews, it becomes very, very difficult, and that's why we should get away from some of the rhetoric of as a Jew, I say, and here's what Jews think, and instead should be interested in having an actually analytical debate rather than an identitarian debate where we try to work out what anti-Semitism is and not just try to work out how people feel because they happen to have a certain kind of identity. I want to just say something about the reasons why people might get this wrong, which aren't cynical. Because I think part of the problem has been that people see a lot of hysteria. They see the claim that Jeremy Corbyn represents an existential threat to Jewish life in Britain. Now, let's be clear, that is to compare Jeremy Corbyn to something like the Nazis, and I think that's obviously hyperbolic.
So that was the claim made by the Free Jewish newspapers
absolutely.
in that joint headline. That was after the IHRA
absolutely.
decision.
Yeah. And people think, well, either they're right, and most people on the left, I think that they're not right, or this is just a really cynical smear. And I think there are cynics involved in this who don't really believe any of this. But I think that most people who believe this are decent, well-intentioned people. And they're right that anti-Semitism is a real problem in the Labour Party. But there are also problems around the entanglement of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, for example, which is not people cynically trying to conflate two things which they know to be different, but which is rather lots of Jewish people, and I was brought up like this, thinking of Israel as the Jewish collectivity, so that when they see people attacking Israel, what goes on is a kind of projective anti-identification, if you like, rather than projective identification. So you project your image of Israel, which is as the Jewish collectivity, you see people attacking that, and you think, my God, these people must be anti-Semites, and you really believe that. And that happens on both sides of this debate. People on my side of the debate, the anti-Zionist side, think of Israel as a colonial, racist endeavor. They see people defending it, and they think, my God, you people must be racists. So there's a lot of this projection work that goes on, which means that people can misdiagnose anti-Semitism without being cynical. The other side of this has nothing to do with Israel, and has been much less commented on, which is, I think, there are lots of anxieties around the passing of neoliberalism and technocracy and the return of antagonistic politics. in which anti-Semitism as a brand of anti-elitism re-emerges as an anxiety, and it re-emerges a real presence as well when people are trying to find their way to an antagonistic class politics again, and the left's been so absent for so long. People really reach for anti-Semitic tropes, but also often kind of defenders of neoliberal technocracy see the shadow of anti-Semitism in all anti-elitism. And you see that in the letter the Board of Deputies wrote to Jeremy Corbyn, which wasn't just like, you're a critic of Israel, so you're an anti-Semite. It was also, you have this far-left worldview about class struggle, so you're an anti-Semite. And I think there are some really dangerous conflations going on there. Again, often not cynical, but naive. And then also that this important dual nature of anti-Semitism. It's both a theory about the Rothschilds controlling the world and the Trotskys trying to overthrow the world order. So you can imagine Corbynites very much in the anti-Semitic frame, a bit like the anti-Semite used to imagine Jews, that these are like conspirators trying to overthrow the general interest. These are nasty. That was long a way that Palestinians were imagined. Not a coincidence that Edward Said once referred to himself as the last Jewish intellectual. Palestinians were long imagined in that old anti-Semitic frame as these troublemakers at the margins trying to overthrow decent Western society. That is now how Corbynites are imagined, using anti-Semitic frames. At the same time, people see anti-Semitism in all anti-elitism. And I think those are problems. So I think there's a real misidentification that goes on sometimes, but the evidence is also clear. We've got the reams of tweets from councillors saying that Hitler was right and whatever, to say that I think there's a real problem in the Labour Party, as there is across British society.
I mean, I tend to be fairly suspicious of the argument that sort of like far-left politics melts into anti-Semitism quite easily. I mean, I feel like what you suggested a little bit at the beginning is that anti-Semitism is what happens when you veer away from a sort of structural Marxism. So when you start to see the oppressor as an agent as opposed to a structure.
That's right.
But I kind of disagree with that, because I feel like you can say there is a sort of global elite, financial elite, who benefits from neoliberalism. Sort of like the David Harvey argument, which is that the capitalist class got pretty organised, and they did, using their political agency and their organisation and their networks, impose a particular regime, a particular political economic regime on the Western world. And I think you can quite, reasonably have that analysis of the world and it not be particularly natural for that to fall into anything anti-Semitic at all. And I feel in a way that one thing that people might be not suspicious of, but might be wary of, is the idea that because these charges were made against the Labour Party, and let's say potentially for politically motivated reasons, we sort of post facto went back and projected onto quite reasonable anti-elite, anti-capitalism, some sort of underlying anti-Semitism to make sense of a furore that happened for quite different reasons. That's the hypothesis. I'm not coming here with evidence. That's partly from sort of my experience of being on the far left and from looking at this debate. I don't know how much you think that could have.
Well, I think the first thing we should do is quash this idea that anti-elitism is the preserve of the left. So that if you say, well, anti-Semites think they're punching up against power rather than punching down against victims, that means that there must be something in common with leftism and anti-Semitism. That's a common argument these days, and it's a bizarre one. The right has often had pretensions of anti-elitism, and I think anti-Semitism is one brand of right-wing anti-elitism. You don't have to go back to 1930s fascism, talked about championing the Volk against against global elites, to think about Nigel Farage saying Brexit's a victory for little people, or just the daily tabloid stuff about union barons opposing the interests of ordinary people. So let's get rid of the idea that saying that anti-Semitism is a brand of mistaken anti-elitism is to say it's specifically left-wing. It can appear on the left, but in Hungary and Austria right now it appears on the right. I think, though, I forgot what I was about to say. So what makes it a right-wing anti-elitism is partly that it relies on this view of individuals as ciphers for culturally cohered, racially cohered, religiously cohered interests. So it reads the lines of antagonism not as being really ultimately about power in the world, which is how David Harvey would think about neoliberalism, but as being about race, culture, ethnicity. And that's really important. And you're right, because I think there's some left-wing scholarship on anti-Semitism which risks sometimes getting too close to the view that all anti-elitist politics is inherently anti-Semitic. And there's a political current in Germany that I think comes too close to thinking like that as well. It's important to stress the dangers lie so heavily in this culture, race, religion way of thinking about politics, because the anti-Semite has a picture of the powerful Jewish banker, but also feels the need to loathe the Chassid, the strictly Orthodox Jew who walks down the street with payers with side curls in Stamford Hill in North London. Now, most Chassidim in London are not very wealthy. They're certainly not part of any international neoliberal offensive, for example, and David Harvey certainly wouldn't think that they are. So it's important to differentiate anti-Semitism from generic anti-elitism. Having said that, I have some differences, and it's to get into a different discussion, but I have some problems with David Harvey's account of the rise of neoliberalism, and I think
that's a different show.
And I think it's a different show, but I certainly think that Marxists ought to spend much more time celebrating Marx's move against contemporary socialist currents in his own time, which was his emphasis on structures that imprison all of us, capitalists included, within their social logics, rather than thinking that the problem was individuals. And I think if Marxists stress that account of the world, and it's useful for thinking about imperialism as well as about capitalism, then I think we're better equipped to fight anti-Semitism.
Let's go for the IHRA definition and the examples. That's probably the biggest point of conflict between the current Labour leadership and these Jewish organisations we were talking about before, the mainstream Jewish organisations that, as you say, are quite representative of British Jews.
As I say, I think saying representative British Jews is such a minefield. It's such a. But certainly, it's not the case that they are just a fringe who speak for nobody but themselves.
I think that's the relevant point, because the relevant point is that I think the left, when this row started, the argument was JLM don't even represent Jews; they're just a pro-Israel faction, and we can basically ignore their concerns because they've got nothing to do with Judaism.
Yeah, that shouldn't be the left's line.
And
at
then
all.
I think that now what people have come to realise is actually these organisations do reflect the opinions of a lot of people, and a lot of people who aren't motivated purely by cynical reasons, even if they might be mistaken. I mean, that's an option. What someone like Naomi, I always forget her surname, from Jewish Voice for Labour.
Wimborne Idrissi.
Yeah, so she was on Sky News saying, they asked her, well, if anti-Semitism isn't a huge problem in the Labour Party, why is it that British Jews are so concerned about it? And she was like, well, because they've been told there's a huge problem in the Labour Party. So she's basically saying fear has been whipped up.
Yeah, and I think that's not quite right, because lots of people have actually experienced it. You know, some of the 68 rabbis who signed that letter, which was dismissed by Pete Wilsman in the Labour NEC, so 68 rabbis who said they're concerned about severe and widespread anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I don't know if Pete Wilsman knows that some of them are members of the Labour Party, and some of them I know have been members of the Labour Party for a long time. So, they might have actually experienced it. So the idea that Jews are fickle and silly and can just be sort of misled very easily, I think is ground we shouldn't get onto. As I've said, I think that lots of people are wrong, and the evidence is clear that there is an incongruity between where British Jews think anti-Semitism lies, that is overwhelmingly in the Labour Party, and the fact, which is they're not wrong that there's lots of it in the Labour Party. Their mistake isn't that they overestimate it in the Labour Party, it's that they underestimate actually how pervasive it is across society. I think, I would say this, wouldn't I? Because they're not socialists who have an analysis that says that prejudice is endemic to hierarchical societies. But anyway, sorry, you were going to ask.
So I got a sidetrack, but that was a very interesting point, so I'm glad we did. The question was about the IHRA, so just tell me what's wrong with it, or tell me what's right about it. Tell me how we should look at the IHRA definitions and examples.
Right. So the real difference between Labour's NEC's Code of Conduct and the IHRA comes down to these 10 words: the proposition that the existence of the State of Israel, of a State of Israel, is a racist endeavour, and the proposition that thinking that is anti-Semitic. And I don't think thinking that is anti-Semitic at all. And I think the first question we should ask here is, how did we make a people disappear? Right? How did we render invisible the Palestinian people who live today, as they have done since 1948, deprived of the sorts of human dignity that we consider rights for other peoples all over the world? And very many people are deprived of those rights. But the Palestinians have been so whitewashed that we can have a debate about anti-Semitism, and it's right that we do, and recognise it as serious, and it's right that we do, and then see no problem as consistent anti-racists with adopting a definition of anti-Semitism that just looks away from the mountains of historical evidence that suggests that there was a Nakba, a catastrophe of historic proportions in 1948 when Israeli towns and cities and villages were built, were prepared to be built on the ruins of Palestinian towns, cities and villages from which people were chased. Now, I think Palestinians should have the right to say that their being forced to leave their homes in 1948 to make way for people of a different racial background from them was a racist endeavor. And I don't think, by the way, that only Palestinians should have the right to say that because it's their experience. I think that honest people who are consistent anti-racists should say that. And should be proud to say that and to say at the same time that they oppose anti-Semitism and see no contradiction between the two. The two come from the same place. The view that every single human being should have a right to a home, it's that simple. And to live in that home in freedom, it's that simple. And in security, it's that simple. If we believe those things, then we're resolutely opposed to people daubing things on synagogues in Britain, anti-Semitic abuse, and we're resolutely opposed to the Israeli state. So I think the IHRA definition, look, it comes close to racism itself because it makes the Palestinian people and their history invisible. I think Labour's NEC's code of conduct is better. It's not perfect. And it also goes too far, it's too soft on racism as far as I'm concerned. For example, it insists that Israel must be treated as a democratic nation. That to me is bizarre. You know, Israel is a nation that if you go to the West Bank, politicians go and campaign in the West Bank for votes because Jewish settlers who live there can vote. Loads of other people live under military law and can't vote just because they're not Jews. That's racism. It's certainly not democracy, just as apartheid in South Africa wasn't democracy, even though some people did have the right to vote there. So I think Labour NEC's code of conduct isn't perfect, but it's certainly right that it doesn't have these really worrying words from the IHRA.
I mean, in a way, when we're talking about like the concrete realities of Israel-Palestine, it seems a shame to go on to sort of semantic points, but in terms of defence of the IHRA, I think there's a very stupid defence that often gets made of it by people that don't really know what they're talking about, which is there's plenty of ways to critique the government of Israel without critiquing the existence of Israel. And it's sort of like what you've completely ignored is that Palestinians should both be able to critique the government policies of Israel and be able to critique the ideology in the project that explains those policies, which is to create an ethnic nation. But there's also a sort of more nuanced defence of the IHRA examples, which is that it doesn't forbid you to say the state of Israel is a racist endeavour, but to say a state of Israel is a racist endeavour. So in theory, hypothetically, this is the kind of argument that Adam Wagner, who's a lawyer who's had some fairly good threads on Twitter, but he says this shouldn't actually inhibit the ability of Palestinians to say the creation of the actual Israel, which displaced them, was anti-Semitic, because they can admit that a state of Israel, if it was somewhere else on a piece of empty land, would in theory be fine. I mean, what do you think about that particular defence?
Well, it is slightly bizarre to move from all of the nastiness of contemporary debates in the Labour Party to this sort of abstract consideration of what perhaps ought to be the case. The IHRA did not say that they were banning the view that a Jewish collectivity or a Jewish nation state is a racist endeavour. They said a state of Israel, capital I. And so the way that's been used in the real world in trying to shut down Israeli Apartheid Week events by a councillor in Barnet and trying to shut down people who advocate boycotting the state of Israel is to shut down people who believe that the state of Israel is a racist endeavour. I don't know what a state of Israel means. Is it still a state of Israel if it were based in Africa, as was initially a Zionist proposal or an offer that was made? Or is it only a state of Israel if you mean any state that is in Palestine, because that's what capital I Israel means? I don't know. What I know is that this is worrying, dodgy terrain. And that's why the original lead author of this text has said, of the IHRA text, Kenneth Stern, has said very clearly that he now worries that it's used to shut down legitimate debate. And as I say, this isn't just a free speech issue, though it is that too. It's also a question of real historical evidence and of consistent anti-racism. It's not just like some people should have the freedom to say they're opposed to Israel. It's like we as consistent anti-racists should say we have great problems with settler colonial projects all over the world. And so on this point, I just want to respond to this claim that says, well, of course you can criticize Israeli governments. That doesn't mean you're criticizing the existence of the state of Israel itself. Look, in the old East Germany, there were reformists who thought that the government policies needed to change, and there were revolutionaries who thought that the whole architecture of the state had to go. The same was true in apartheid South Africa, the same was true in Rhodesia, the same was true in Algeria and in Mozambique. And so Israel's not unique by any means. It is a state premised on a law of return which says that Jews all over the world can go and live there, and an absentee property law which says Palestinians who are chased from their homes can't return and claim their property. It's a state founded in racism. And I think that should be an anti-racist perspective which is allowed in this debate. And it would be a great worry if in the name of condemning anti-Semitism, we shut out that perspective, as well as those more liberal critics of Israel who accept the existence of the Israeli state, as, for example, Jeremy Corbyn does, but who want to criticize its individual policies.
Yeah, when I see these sort of like idiot right-wing Labour MPs that clearly just don't understand what they're talking about or are very cynical, I like to imagine them saying, in the 70s, that, look, it's completely legitimate to criticise the government policies of Rhodesia.
Right.
But you can do that without critiquing the state of Rhodesia
That's right,
itself. And they're saying that to Zimbabweans.
Yeah, that's right.
It's fucking ridiculous.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, at this point, we're going to go to my interview last night with Norman Finkelstein. I started by asking him about this issue of, or this question of, whether we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I've already warned Barnaby that he's kind of scathing of of this particular interpretation of what is going on. But we're going to watch this. It's about 15 minutes long. Apologies, the sound isn't amazing. I recorded it quite late last night, and Gary wasn't here to support me with the technical issues. And you guys in the comments, you know what we're like when he's not around. He's just grown from the other room. Anyway, this is Norman Finkelstein. We will be discussing this afterwards, of course. It's subtitled. So this is Norman Finkelstein from New York. What do you think about this idea that we can walk and chew gum at the same time?
I think it's completely disingenuous, and I wouldn't have anything to do with it. It's the equivalent of when you say during the Israeli massacres in Gaza that you have to condemn both sides. That if you only condemn one side, somehow you're being prejudiced or you're being partisan. So during the last Israeli massacre in Gaza, in Operation Protective Edge, 550 Palestinian children were killed. One Israeli child was killed. It doesn't take a knowledge of higher mathematics to figure out the proportion, 550 to 1. 18,000 Palestinian homes were destroyed. One Israeli home was destroyed. 18,000 to 1. And you want me to be even-handed? No. The record is not even-handed. And I'm not going to pretend to this fake, disingenuous, and cynical even-handedness. There is in the Labour Party a handful of fruitcakes who still refer to things like the Rothschilds, which for 99.9% of the British Labour Party, they don't even know who they're talking about. They don't even know who are the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds were a 19th century family. I probably have more money in the bank, and I don't have much money in the bank, than the Rothschilds do now. And you want me to put on the same plane a massive, vicious, cynical attack being launched against the great hope, not just of the British Labour Party, but the British working people and the whole of the Western left, because the right wing has been very successfully organizing, and even globally, this ghastly collection of strongmen, everyone ranging from Duterte in the Philippines to Modi in India to Trump in the United States, and so many others in between. And now there really is a polarization occurring on a global scale. And a Corbyn victory would be an enormous breakthrough in fighting back. It would certainly be a huge boost and inspiration to the American left, which will probably have, but not certainly, a Bernie Sanders who is what you might call a Corbyn light, L-I-T-E, a Corbyn light, in the next presidential election. And you want to put in the same plane the struggle against a handful of nutters, 0.1% of the Labour Party, with this grotesque, cynical, contrived, fake, fabricated attack on Corbyn by the whole of British ruling elites and the whole of the British media. No, this is not a question of walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Your opinion and your relationship to discussions of anti-Semitism are idiosyncratic compared to the mainstream Jewish community in Britain. So 68 rabbis who were from a broad spectrum of Jewish opinion, they wrote a letter saying that Labour was, or contained, severe and widespread anti-Semitism. Sounds like you disagree with that.
I won't say I disagree with it. I would say I'd like to see the evidence. I've not seen any evidence. I've seen none. I've seen Jeremy Corbyn acknowledge 0.1%. I've not seen anyone methodically, systematically adduce any evidence to dispute Jeremy Corbyn's estimate. So I won't say I disagree with them. I would say I'd like to see your evidence. Show me the evidence. I say the same thing to Barnaby Raine. He says it's a very, very serious problem across the board in British society. I looked carefully for his evidence, and all I read was, when he was 16 years old, somebody called him a kike. You know, I suppose that may have been traumatizing for Barnaby Raine, although his ego seems securely intact, so it doesn't seem as if he were traumatized. But I don't see the evidence. And here's the other problem I have. The evidence which everybody normally accepts, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the evidence which everybody conventionally accepts, the YouGov polls, the Pew polls, not only are they not refuted, they're not even mentioned. It's like they never happened. They've been carrying on these polls for over a decade. There's a huge accumulation of polling data. And not only does nobody bother to refute it, nobody even mentions it. It's like they're talking in a vacuum. There's a Polish expression that my late mother used to use, from empty to vacuum. And that's how I feel when I'm watching these debates. You start out with a premise, anti-Semitism is a serious problem, and then now we'll proceed to the real issue. Will Jeremy Corbyn deal with it? Okay, but I haven't seen any evidence for the premise. You're asking me whether Jeremy Corbyn would deal with it, and so the woman presenter on Sky News, she turns to both guests, one from the CAA and Barnaby Raine, and she asks, can he seriously deal with it? And the fellow from the CAA says, no. And Barnaby Raine says, well, I want to see what he does. I'm going to give him a chance. But then nobody entertained the possibility for which all the evidence seems to sustain. There's no serious problem. Now, I know that tires you, that bores you. It's not fun. It's not sexy. It's not exciting to say, I don't know what they're talking about. There's no problem. But sorry, I'm not going to somehow Lillian Hellman, an American playwright, she famously said during the witch hunts after World War II against alleged communists who were supposedly under your bed, in your closet, and in your bread box. She said, I'm not going to cut my cloth to fit this year's fashions. And I say the same thing to you. I'm not cutting my cloth to fit the current fashion. I know fully well that in order to get involved in this debate, what I need to say. I have to accept the premise. That's the prerequisite for being a respectable party to the debate. But I see no evidence for it, and I'm not going to accept it for the sake of my ego.
I mean, let's look at strategy, right? So you have a view of this crisis, which is that basically it's manufactured. And that Jeremy Corbyn is under attack by people who don't like his politics. They don't like his class politics. They don't like his pro-Palestine politics. But this row is damaging the party. It is damaging Jeremy Corbyn. It's making it less likely that he'll become Prime Minister. It's making it less likely that he can implement the policies that will benefit the working class and benefit the Palestinians. How do we make this stop?
Well, I'm old-fashioned. I think Jeremy Corbyn should speak the truth. Number one, the other side has made clear they want his scalp. The fellow from the CAA, he said on Sky News, he said, asked, what do you want? He said, I want him to leave public office. Well, that's pretty clear. He doesn't want him to reform the Labour Party. He doesn't want him to revamp the Labour Party. He wants him to leave. And I think that's an honest, probably the only honest thing the fellow said. That's what they want. And they won't settle for less. You know why they won't settle for less? I'm going to tell you why, because I know politics. Because they know that Jeremy can't be bought. That's the problem. Most people with sufficient amount of inducement, even Naz Shah, at some point she went through the ritual of self-humiliation. Oh my God, I didn't realize I was an anti-Semite. Now I realize it, and I'll be atoning for the rest of my life. I'll be going to Holocaust education classes, everything, first thing in the morning, and every night before going to bed, I'm going to read another piece of another classic in the Nazi Holocaust. You know, you could go through that, but they know he won't do it. And that's why he has to be crucified. So when you talk about strategy, let's be clear. What's at stake? They won't stop until they have his scalp. That's it. That's the bottom line. The guy from the CAA was very clear. He has to remove himself from public office. That's what he said. So don't try to appease them. Don't try to placate them. It's not going to happen. Nothing you do will stop this juggernaut. Will stop them. And then I think you should speak to facts. Quote exactly the facts that I cited to you today. I looked at the poll data. I look at my own estimate. I don't see an existential threat in British society. I see no evidence of it in the Labour Party. There may be some pockets of nutters in the party, and sure, we have no problem getting rid of them if it comes to that. But that's not why 350,000 people joined the Labour Party in the last 2 years. They joined it because they're hurting, because they're homeless in our country, because there are jobless in our country, because a tiny percentage of greedy bastards are stealing from all of us in their insatiable thirst and hunger for money. And they saw in me a hope of, if not reversing it, at least mitigating it, so people have a chance in life. And you may not like to hear this, folks, but that's why they joined, and I'm responsible to them. And that's where I'm devoting my energies. So listen carefully. It's
goodbye. I have other things to do. And that's what he should do. Put a stop to it. I said he committed the biggest error of his life, of his political life. In an article on Friday. He thinks that's going to appease them? It's going to placate them? It's crazy. I know these people. They won't stop.
Norman Finkelstein speaking to me last night from New York. Barnaby, there were obviously a bunch of claims made, a bunch of arguments that were quite different from yours. Norman is saying that we can pretend. I'm summarising his argument here. This isn't necessarily my views, obviously. We can pretend that there is anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but basically this is all fabricated. And what's going on here is a purely politically motivated attack, which is to try and bring down Jeremy Corbyn. And every time we accept any premises which are argued by the other side, we are losing ground, basically. And not only is losing ground sort of in itself problematic because it means we're lying to ourselves, but also it's a terrible strategy because the people who want to get rid of Corbyn are never going to be satisfied. If we accept the IHRA definition, if we get rid of Pete Wilsman, there'll be a new scandal, there'll be a new reason to attack Jeremy Corbyn and to claim that he is not capable of leading a party or a country. I think some of the points he made there is that we can see this now at the moment in that many people, when they're asked about what would be the solution to this crisis, they say nothing short of Jeremy Corbyn resigning. So it's being made quite explicit what's going on here. So I suppose now's your chance to respond to what the arguments that Norman was making there.
Well, his arguments represent, I think, a real current on the left. Incidentally, I first met Norman Finkelstein when I was hosting him for a talk about Palestine, and we just ended up angrily shouting at each other as I went to his hotel to meet him, as I accused him of being soft on the state of Israel because he was condemning the BDS movement and demanding that we should all speak out very aggressively for a two-state solution, which I thought was dead in the water. And he condemned me then to the audience as a sort of far-left radical who had to grow up and mature. So it's a funny memory, and I don't feel that the situation's reversed now. Actually, I feel that I'm taking the consistently anti-racist position. He's right, of course, that many of those attacking Jeremy Corbyn right now just want to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. Some of them are using this for cynical reasons, and others because they honestly believe that there's a distinctive issue of far-left anti-Semitism and that British politics will not be a racist place anymore if they get rid of one of the only anti-racists in Parliament from the leadership of the Labour Party. There are people who genuinely believe that. And whether they're cynics or whether they really believe it, as lots of them do, obviously we on the left should have no truck with that kind of view. But I think we should fight anti-Semitism as a left-wing principle, not because we think that if we scrabble together a fight against anti-Semitism, we might just manage to make the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn go away. That would be hideously naive. I don't believe that for a moment. Though I also think there are lots of British Jews who are honestly concerned about anti-Semitism, and saying that it's all just a smear, I think is wrong. He says there are only 0.1% of members of the Labour Party who are anti-Semites. And he's right that that's the figure Corbyn's used for the number of disciplinary cases. But I think it risks being a bit of a red herring, because that's to identify the people who are so frothing at the mouth that they tweet that Hitler was right or whatever it is.
I mean, I think that's not necessarily true, because these are complaints, right? These aren't people who've been found guilty.
Yeah,
and we know that some complaints are spurious. So I think to suggest that anyone who's been subject to disciplinary proceedings is frothing at the mouth with anti-Semitism.
That's completely right. And I know people who've been subject to complaints who are nothing like anti-Semites. So that's completely right. But then there's a brag bag coalition we have in this 0.1%. People who were important enough that people wanted to launch complaints against them, or people who were really so frothing at the mouth that everyone could see it and launched a complaint against them. The evidence... Institute for Jewish Policy Research, decent, respected think tank, not some crazed right-wing body, actually. 38% of people in Britain subscribe to at least one anti-Semitic view they found a couple of years ago. So I think the evidence that, as I was saying, I think we should be confident about thinking this as socialists, just like we think about misogyny and homophobia and whatever, that these are widespread prejudices, that's important because I think these kinds of prejudices damage our project, not only because they allow us to be smeared, there's kind of an open goal. If we want to say this is a smear, and it is, then we have to be whiter than white. And I think the Labour Party isn't whiter than white on this, purer than pure. But also because anti-Semitism is really a brand of politics that is going to be damaging to the left. And, if we're serious about thinking about like state power in Britain, the kind of contemporary anti-Semitic politics, which, as I was saying before, is dangerously demobilizing because it relies on thinking that you can never really change anything because some ominous they, whether that's the lizards or the Jews, will never let you change anything. That's a really damaging brand of politics to the radical left. And then the more traditional
the argument would be that that's marginal, though, right?
Right, but then the more traditional...
what Norman's saying is that no one believes in... We can sort of hypothesize that, there is a dodgy brand of left-wing conspiracy theorizing which purports that the problems of the world are all caused by the Rothschilds.
Well, his
argument is that no one actually believes in the Rothschilds.
Right.
So
he also
is so
said
marginal that it's almost a red herring itself.
Right. Well, two things there. Firstly, he also said, well, maybe some people do believe in the Rothschilds, but they're just sort of ignorant. They don't know that's an anti-Semitic trope. And I agree with him completely. And I think that's often missed and forgotten. But that's why we need political education, because the fact that they don't know it's anti-Semitic doesn't make it harmless. Because either it demobilizes our politics, it thinks you can't do anything, or, as in the more traditional anti-Semitic frame, it misdirects our energies. So it was suggesting that there's a cabal of finance, for example, that we need to knock out the banks. And then there's this healthy sphere of sort of British industry that's all okay. And it's just the problem is global finance. And these are the kinds of frames that I think are damaging to really radical socialist politics that are encouraged by anti-Semitic thinking. And I don't think that this kind of general seductiveness of those sorts of frames of thought is limited to some tiny marginal 0.1%. I think the fact that 38% of people hold at least one anti-Semitic view is worrying.
So let's look at that a bit closer, because obviously I spoke to Norman for longer than was sort of in that interview. Yeah. He was sceptical of this broader definition of anti-Semitism, which ends up saying that 38% of the public hold one anti-Semitic view. Can we get some examples of what an anti-Semitic view is, according to that definition, those criteria?
Well, I don't know what examples were used in that report, but it's things like the claim that Jews control the media or Jews control the world's banks, claims like that. And the point is, we would recognize that even if people condemn Islamophobia, if they believe that Muslims are the most violent people in the world, even if they say, well, of course, I don't think we should respond to that with Islamophobic solutions or whatever. Once they start thinking like that misdirects our politics into Islamophobia too quickly, too easily. And so I think we should recognize that these widespread, I think ultimately quite conservative forms of thinking that aim to rescue the image of the West by saying problems are really not organic to the West, but a few outsiders. Those forms of thinking are problems for our politics going forward. I also think he raises a really tellingly bad analogy in the video that we just saw. So he says, you're conceding. It's a bit like people who say we should condemn violence on both sides when Israel bombs Gaza. Now, I'm not one of the people who says that when Israel bombs Gaza, because I think we should have a very clear sense of the massive difference between Israeli power and the heroism of the Palestinian people being pummeled. Thinking that that's an analogous situation means thinking that anti-Semitism is like the state of Israel, that it's some kind of enemy charge. We should think on the left that those two things are not analogous, right? That anti-Semitism is a real problem, and that we on the left are dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism. And so when we say we want to oppose anti-Semitism, that is not a concession to the right. It's a concession to the right when we start saying, oh, and we sign up to your definitions of anti-Semitism that want to render the Palestinian people invisible, for example. And I think part of the problem is that Norman Finkelstein spent a long time in debates in America where these things are very, very cynically mobilized. But the evidence in the British Labour Party is that there is also a real problem, and the left should be proud of fighting it.
Do you think there is a position, so this is almost regardless of what's actually the case in terms of like looking at the future of the Labour Party and looking at sort of the survival of Corbyn, but I suppose it is principled as well, because you want to say, basically, how can this stop? And do you think that this can stop in a way where, one, the Labour Party hasn't sold out the Palestinians, and two, I suppose there'll always be some people trying to bring down Corbyn, but at the moment it seems like representative organisations of many Jewish people in Britain, I've moved away from the Jewish community phrase,
nice,
are at odds.
As I say, I've used it as well.
Are at odds with the current Labour leadership. And do you see that there is a way out of this? To put it in cynical terms, can Corbyn's Can the people currently opposed to Corbyn be appeased, or can they be satisfied? Obviously, whichever word we choose has implications. But anyway, I won't bore you with the semantics. You get the point of the question.
Yeah. Well, I think we ain't seen nothing yet. If we are thinking for the first time in a very long time about trying to put a socialist into the organs of power in a major imperialist country. So I think starting from the position of how are we going to make the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn go away is not a good starting point.
Specifically on this issue,
yeah.
right?
Well, so I want Jeremy Corbyn to be doing lots of things that right-wingers will cynically try to smear as anti-Semitic, like, for example, taking decent stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and things that lots of well-meaning British Jews might misdiagnose as anti-Semitic. And I want to have a serious discussion that begins in respect and not just condemning them as Trump fanatics. But I want Corbyn to do things that I'm sure will get him smeared in all sorts of ways. But I'd rather be sitting here talking to you today about Jeremy Corbyn's plans to impose sanctions on the State of Israel and the Jewish Chronicle labeling that anti-Semitic, as they may do, than talking to you today about people who bring in discussions of Jews financing the slave trade in the context of debates about anti-Semitism, as one activist did, or bring in Zionist collaboration with the Nazis in the context of a discussion of anti-Semitism, as someone else did. Those are not progressive positions. They're not anti-racist positions. They're not positions that advance the politics of Jeremy Corbyn. They're not positions that understand that we come from a consistently anti-racist socialist tradition. And they are positions that we should fight on principle and also should recognize as strategically damaging to the sorts of cause that we're trying to push, but also, as I say, should fight on principle. So yeah, I don't think I have a solution to make this row go away. I think I have the principled solution.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So I mean, you're basically saying that, well, I suppose there's another problem, right? Well, not necessarily a problem, which is about forgiveness. So I mean, Pete Wilsman, I think, is quite a good example. So obviously he said something that was, that I think was insensitive, pretty stupid. I think dismissing 68 rabbis from a broad swathe of opinion, even if he probably wasn't calling them all Trump supporters, but I mean, definitely what he said was incredibly dismissive of concerns that a lot of people have. But you can see that as someone lashing out, or as someone who's genuinely confused, because obviously lots of ordinary Labour members who never really thought about anti-Semitism before in their life, like, I mean, I hadn't thought much about anti-Semitism before in my life. They've seen Jeremy Corbyn be attacked from every angle for the most ridiculous things for 3 years. And they've seen organisations which call themselves representatives of British Jews, which say what seem to be completely outlandish things. They're saying that Jeremy Corbyn is an existential threat to Jews in Britain. So Labour supporters are looking at these two facts. They're looking at this group is representative of Jews. This group is saying Jeremy Corbyn is an existential threat to British Jews. What the fuck's going on? You know, and I think in that incredibly confusing situation where it's very difficult to disentangle what is a smear, what's real anti-Semitism, that potentially condemning someone as soon as they say something inappropriate or as soon as they say something insensitive is potentially unsympathetic to the difficult situation that many people find themselves in at this point, and the confusing situation many people are in. So how do you square this idea of we should be, obviously what the left should be arguing about is Israel-Palestine. They should be arguing about rights for Palestinians. We should not be arguing about whether or not it's anti-Semitic to talk about Rothschild's bankers.
Exactly. We shouldn't be arguing about that because we should all agree on that.
But does that mean that as soon as someone says it, we should kick them out, which is going to be the demand from these organisations? As soon as someone says anything that's sort of like remotely inappropriate, the demand is expel them, expel them, expel them. And there'll be lots and lots of pressure until that person is expelled. So I don't know if you've got, obviously this is a difficult question. This is sort of like how the Labour Party should be managed. But how do we navigate that idea of both being forgiving of people and being uncompromising in sort of saying this kind of language isn't up for debate?
I mean, people are under the most extraordinary pressure right now because there is a fiery campaign against Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, and people who feel very loyal to the Labour Party feel defensive, and it's tough for them, and I get that. But the Muslim Council of Britain wants an inquiry into Islamophobia in the Tory party. So how did the Tory party respond? They suggested that no one should trust the MCB because they take supposedly dodgy positions on other political questions. So they're not really a sort of genuine Muslim voice that we should respect. And then they wheeled out Sajid Javid to say that he disagreed with the MCB and he was speaking as a Muslim. People on the left, I saw it on my Facebook, rightly mocked that approach and condemned it as tin-eared. If Tories had seen the polling evidence, which suggests that the vast majority of British Muslims vote Labour, not Tory, had seen these attacks and had said it's all partisan, if these attacks had then been ratcheted up into a national campaign, which, you know, even though Boris Johnson just today said that Muslim women in burqas look like letterboxes, we're not seeing a national campaign about Islamophobia in the Tory party, and we should. If it became that kind of national campaign, I'm sure that lots of Tories who've given their whole life to the party, feeling under pressure, feeling defensive, would shout out at a meeting and say this isn't a real issue, or it's being, or, you know, because it's not quite what he said, but, or, you know, it's being horribly cynically misused. But if the Tory party was serious about fighting Islamophobia, then they'd recognise that that kind of dismissal of the problem just wasn't helpful or constructive. The thing is, I don't think the Tory party would ever be serious about fighting Islamophobia, but I do expect from a left-wing Labour Party that we'd be serious about fighting bigotry. Because I know that the left have often been the only people who've been willing to stand up for Jews when we faced real existential threats. And I'm not glib about that, and I don't think that that's guaranteed in perpetuity to be true. And so I think we have to make sure that we have a left that is good at fighting anti-Semitism, just as we have to make sure we have a left that's good at fighting Islamophobia, and just as we make sure we have a left, as I've said, that's better at standing up and standing alongside the Palestinian people.
All right, we've been talking for quite a while, but I want to take a few questions. So I'm just going to take 3 questions. So if you want to ask Barnaby anything, now is your time to comment. Comment in the next minute. I'll choose 3 of them. And then we are both going to go for a beer somewhere that's slightly cooler than the Novara Media Studios. Whilst you are typing those questions, please remember the same request I make every week, which is if you want to make a new media for a different politics possible, if you want to help our organisation grow and expand, if you want to help us make content more often to a higher quality, if you want to see live debates between people in New York and people in London, and if you want to see someone that isn't sweating quite so profusely on your computer screens, please go to support.novaramedia. The more money you subscribe with, the better. £3, £5, £10. Every little helps.
The dossier on anti-Semitism in Labour from the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which includes offensive misdiagnoses accusing people of anti-Semitism who aren't, but also includes lots of cases that are clearly anti-Semitic and people who are really members of the Labour Party. So go and look at it. It's there. This denial doesn't help, and it's got nothing in common with real anti-racist left-wing politics.
Oh, we lost sound for a bit. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting instructions. Ask Barnaby the question again. What question, Gary? Just shout to me.
Just the last one.
The last one. We're just going to move on anyway. Did they hear the end of the answer?
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. The next question was, would a named left-wing campaign to fight anti-Semitism within the Labour Party be a useful endeavour?
Well, I'd like to think that campaign could just be called the Labour Party. I think, I think that there's a real risk here that rather than being confident about our left-wing anti-racist principles, we get so defensive that we think that we couldn't possibly take the battle to anti-Semitism and be serious about condemning people that we might have known and worked with for years, in the case of some older people in the Labour Party who are anti-Semites. We couldn't possibly do that, or who are soft on anti-Semitism, while at the same time we concede ground on Palestine, because we think that that's the place that we have to apologise in order to appease attacks on the Labour Party. So yes, it would be good to have a consistently anti-racist line in the Labour Party, which took the war to both anti-Semitism and to the racism of the Israeli state. That's all too absent right now. I don't know whether an institutional campaign would be the way to do it. But yeah, I think it would have to be a campaign against anti-Semitism and against the invisibility of the Palestinian people. And it would have to be serious about both of them, and it would have to not use either of those things as just an excuse not to talk about the other one.
This is a good question from Soweto Kinch, sort of riffing off what Norman said. He says, was the expulsion of Mark Wadsworth akin to cutting cloth to suit today's fashion? Basically, was it done for reasons of political expediency? And do we lose authenticity by conceding so much?
So I don't know. Obviously, I wasn't sat on the committee, and I don't know the details of Mark Wadsworth's case. I'm told by some people that he accused a member of parliament who collaborated with the right-wing press of collaborating with the right-wing press, and she then said that that was an anti-Semitic trope. And I think that's evidence of the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, sort of projective pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, that people on the right see anti-Semitism everywhere, and see, because they have this anti-Semitic frame in which if you...
It's important to say that that's evidence of anti-Semitism. No, that's evidence of the...
the
mistaken perception of anti-Semitism.
Sorry. What I mean is on the part of the people who accused him of anti-Semitism. If that story's true, and I don't know if it is, but if that story's true, then the moment they hear anyone saying a right-wing MP is collaborating with the press, they think, oh my God, he must mean because she's a Jew.
Or they think this is an opportunity that we can use to attack a left-wing member of the Labour Party.
Absolutely, but I'm saying if people really believe that, and I think some people do, then that's evidence of the pervasiveness of a certain kind of anti-Semitic thinking. Other people tell me that he might have done other things as well. So I don't know the full details of the disciplinary case about him. But as I've said, I oppose this language of we're conceding too much when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism, because I don't think we should regard fighting anti-Semitism as a concession if we're on the left.
But it's potentially the case that if the Labour Party doesn't come up with sort of like a coherent analysis of what is and what isn't anti-Semitism, then they will dictate the development of their policy based on sort of always meeting people halfway in whatever demand is made, right?
So let's not do that.
So concessions... Yeah. This process can happen in the form of concessions, but we don't want it to.
Yeah. And if an anti-racist activist sees a right-wing Labour MP passing stories to the Daily Telegraph and objects to that and doesn't give a damn about her racial or ethnic or religious background when he does it, and that gets called anti-Semitism either cynically or, as I've said, naively, because people are so invested in this anti-Semitic frame that they project it everywhere. They assume it must be because she was a Jew. Then that's obviously bad. If he did lots of other bad things, then he should be disciplined. So I don't know.
Great. We're going to leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining me, Barnaby.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you to Norman Finkelstein for joining me yesterday from New York. It was a shame you couldn't do a back and to and fro, back and forth.
I'd have wanted to remind him of
a back and forth. That's it. But I'm sure if you wanted to continue the debate, we could publish it or we could do something along those lines. But yeah, this was Tisky Sour. This is Novara Media. I've said it already, but I'm going to say it again. To make this show possible, please go to support.novaramedia.com. Also, make sure you subscribe to this on Twitter. No, subscribe to this on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. Tell all your friends about this show. And the comments will be open underneath it. Thank you, Barnaby Raine. Thank you for watching. See you next week.